Okay, here we go. Now, therefore he brought again with them the king of the Chaldeans. This was the Babylonian king. Killed the young men with the sword in their house of their sanctuary. Had no compassion on young man or virgin. And he goes on that they took all the articles of the house of God, verse 18, verse 19. They burned the house of God, burned down the walls. And here's the reason why, verse 21, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. And what's interesting about that, she had enjoyed her Sabbaths. So 70 years. 70 years. The reason why he allowed them to be in captivity for 70 years, for as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath. The land rested for 70 years to fulfill 70 years. So if you do the math on this, it seemed like that for a period of about 490 years before the captivity, they had not fulfilled this command to what God said. 70 years. So you think about that and meditate upon that, how God was going to make sure that everything's done the way he wanted it to be done. All right, he emphasizes the idea of the 6 years, the seventh year, and then every 6 days, what? The seventh day you are to what? Rest. 3 annual feasts. And again, this is found in Leviticus chapter 23, where he spends a lot more time talking about the feast in Leviticus chapter 23, and you might want to jot that down because it might just happen to show up again before long. And then, the 3 feasts he mentions is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. What is that also known as? Remember, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were right there close together. So sometimes you're looking at it and you think that both of them are at the same time. Secondly, the Feast of Harvests, which is also known as what? Pentecost. All right. 5 weeks. No. Yeah, 5. No. Yeah, 5 weeks later. 49 days plus 1 is the Feast of Pentecost. And that's the Feast of Harvest. And that's the Feast of the Ingathering. And so that's an emphasis there. And then he emphasizes the idea of the Feast of the Ingathering at the end of the year, which would also be known as the Feast of the Tabernacles. All righty? And again, you can read about all these feasts and all the details of these feasts in Leviticus chapter 23 in a lot more detail. All right? And again, I wish I had all the time that we could go into a lot more detail about it. Verse 20 through the end of the chapter of chapter 23 is the angel. And we've often talked about the angel before, and we talked about the angel of the Lord sometimes being possibly Jesus pre-incarnate. He says, I send an angel. And again, in this context, the word angel is capitalized, right? So again, it's somebody even above any other angels. Beware of him, obey his voice, do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. If you obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites. That's always interesting. Every time he lists those people that they are going to conquer, this list is found over and over and over again. He said, you shall not bow down to their gods. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and water, and I will take sickness away from the midst of you. No one shall suffer miscarriage. I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people. I'll send hornets to drive out the Hittite, Canaanite, Hivite. And so little by little, notice he says, I will drive them out before you until you have increased and you inherit the land. Read from this passage, go on and read the last part of Joshua on into the book of Judges. The idea was they were to conquer all the land. But after Joshua and that first generation of leaders died, then they did not continue to conquer the land. And so this became, as God would say, that became the thorn in their flesh. But he's telling them this is what happens. This is what's going to happen. You shall not make no covenant with them, verse 32. They shall not dwell in your land, lest you make sin against me, lest they make you sin against me. If you serve their gods, it will be a snare to you. Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. All right, so now he's getting together Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. 70 is one of those numbers that you find over and over and over again. One of your great studies that you could ever possibly do is go through the Bible and see how many times he mentions 40 days. 40 nights. Okay, study that and see all the context of that happening. And then you think about the idea of 70. All right, so there are numbers that comes up again. So there to come up there, verse 3, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And the people again, as they did in chapter 19 before he actually gave them the covenant, the people again said, all the words which the Lord has said we will do. So he wrote all the words of the Lord. He rose up early, built an altar at the foot of the mountain. And again, remember, the altar had to be what? It had to be an earthen altar. It could not be fashioned with a tool. It could only be stone, okay? Stone or earth. That's all there was to it. Remember that? So again, he did that in that respect. And I was doing even a little bit more research on that. And again, this is one of the things that I hadn't thought about. But it may be that God had commanded such so that the people would not worship the altar itself. You know, we worship everything in the world other than God. And so sometimes we worship the works of our hands, right? And so he would say to them, don't build this big altar with your hands and make it so pretty that you're sitting there thinking, boy, don't that look good, you know? And you're bragging more about that than what goes on. So he built an altar at the foot of the mountain, 12 pillars according to 12 tribes of Israel, sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And again, when you're reading in the verse passage in the book of Leviticus, you get into the burnt offerings and peace offerings. He took half the blood and put it in the basins. Half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. What is the purpose of the blood? To sanctify, to set it apart. Think about Jesus, and we often say, John chapter 12, I'll give my life as a ransom for many. And again, the idea of when I see the blood, I will what? I will pass over you. Remember that? Exodus chapter 12. So he took half the blood. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And again, what do the people do? All that the Lord says we will do. Now, again, I wish we had the time. But you can go from here and go to the book of 2 Kings and read about the story of Hezekiah, where Hezekiah would cause the people to make the covenant. And again, the people would stand at the pillars in the temple and they say, all that the Lord says we will do. And again, in the days of the king Josiah. So you see this pattern coming up over and over again. So he took the blood, sprinkled it on the people. Well, that kind of grosses us out a little bit there, don't it? Blood sprinkled on us. But this is the blood of the covenant which God has made with you according to all these words. Then Moses went up, and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, 70 of the people, and they saw the God of Israel. Now, we struggle with this passage. We struggle with this passage because later, in Exodus chapter 32, 33, and 34, we're going to see that Moses wants to see God's face. And God said, no, you can't see my face, and he'll see the back parts of God. And yet in this passage, it says, they saw the God of Israel. I don't know that they necessarily saw the God of Israel as much as we read in Isaiah 6, in Revelation 4 and 5, in the book of Ezekiel chapter 1. I think they're seeing God's majesty as opposed to actually seeing the holiness, the holy God themselves. Okay? And I think sometimes we struggle with that because, again, that some people think, well, if God is too holy, then why do you have them seeing the God of Israel here? Notice under his feet was a paved work of sapphire stone. And it was like the very heavens in its clarity. I want you to key in on that because compare these other passages. And again, if you haven't read them down, write down Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1, and Revelation 4 and 5. When you compare that with what you're reading here, in every situation you find some differences, but you also see some similarities. Also read Revelation 21 and 22. Because again, here's what happens whenever they're there. Revelation 21, 22 talks about where God is and where God dwells. And let me say this, and I'm not teaching the class on Revelation, okay? I'm not teaching Revelation here, okay? But I'm thinking that John is trying to the best of his ability to describe in terms that humans can understand what God's throne and God's dwelling place looks like. And that really when you get down to it, it's like what? I can't describe it because nothing on earth compares to it. And I think that's what it is. So here it is again. he says it was as it were a paved work of sapphire stone. And so on the nobles of the children of Israel, he did not lay his hand. So they saw God and ate and drank. Now, again, this goes back again to the thing that I talked about earlier in Genesis chapter 15, where whenever the covenant was made with Abraham, you remember they cut the covenant and then they made the covenant, and then the two parties that were party to the covenant would what? They would eat a meal together. So what we're happening here in Exodus chapter 24 is where God, in essence, is there with the people and eating with them to ratify the covenant. That's what we are seeing being portrayed here at this moment in time. All right? And so as we're looking at this, again, we struggle with this. They saw God, they ate and drank. Again, I don't know that they actually saw God, because as we see a little bit later on, but I'll explain that a little bit later on as well. So he says, come up to me on the mountain and be there. I'll give you the tablets of stones and the law and the commandments which I have written. So he rose with his sister Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. Now, this is also called Mount Horeb, also called Mount Sinai, but here it's called the mountain of God. Why? God's there. Wherever we are, God's there. And that's what we need to think about in that respect, that God is there. So he said to the elders, wait here for us till we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has a difficulty, let him go to them. He went up to the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain. And the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day, he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire. Now, all of a sudden, you see his glory. And so again, Moses was now on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And beginning in chapter 25 through chapter 32, you have God giving him the command to build the tabernacle. And that's what this is all about. Why in chapter 24 did God ratify the covenant? Well, he left Aaron and Hur and all those other people there on the bottom of the mountain. You remember what did the people say? Whatever the Lord says, we will do. They have affirmed their covenant. As the elders ate with God, that was the seal of the covenant. So in essence, they committed the children of Israel to follow God's covenant. Now, the next 40 days, what you're going to have in Exodus 25 through 31, and 32 starts the break, is where God gives the details of the tabernacle. All right? How it's supposed to be built and everything like that. And next week, we're going to spend some time on that. All righty? Now, in chapter 32, we see the difference. What happens now? The children of Israel, or the people, saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain. The people gathered there and said, come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Now, Moses was on the mountain how long? 40 days and 40 nights. I find that interesting. That's a little over a month and 10 days our time, right? That's not very long. A month's not really long. I know when I was a kid, a month was a whole lot longer than it is now. A month's not very long. You know, the last 12 weeks, 13 weeks, we've been trying to go through this class, and I'm sitting there thinking, boy, I don't know how I'm going to get through it. And of course, I haven't been able to. But again, it's interesting. It's not a long time, is it? And that's 13 weeks. It's not a long time. They heard God's voice. They ratified the covenant. And 40 days later, they said to Aaron, we don't know what happened, so make us gods. And one of the first things God had said on the Ten Commandments is what? You shall not have any other gods before me. Now, I want you to notice what everything's going on here. This story just amazes me every time I read it. And Aaron said to him, break off the golden earrings, which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. So they broke off their golden earrings, which were in their ears, and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold. I'm in Exodus chapter 32, I'm sorry. He received the gold and fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a golden calf. Then he said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So Aaron saw it. He built an altar before it, and he made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. You see that word Lord? That is the word Jehovah, Yahweh. Here's what I think happened. The children of Israel put the pressure on Aaron to make them a god. So Aaron tried to compromise. All right, I can do this. I can make a god out of gold, but I'll call this God Yahweh. And therefore, they will still be worshiping the God of heaven and earth, but, it's going to be in the form of a what? Of a cow. Isn't it the fact that sometimes when we really want to do something, we find ways to twist it to justify what we're doing? And that's the only explanation I can give for Aaron's response here. When Moses comes down off the mountain, and again in Deuteronomy, Moses will say, if it wasn't for the fact I prayed for Aaron, God would have struck him down at that moment in time. And interestingly enough, Aaron still is able to become the priest. So there's a whole lot of things that can be brought out there. Now notice, they arose early on the next day, offered burnt offerings, peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, get down, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. I love that. Notice what God said. They're now your people. They're not mine anymore. Why? What have they done? They've broken my covenant. So they're your people, but you brought them out of the land of Egypt. Now, I want you to really key in on that, because God, or Moses, when he starts talking to God about this, he says, look, I didn't deliver them. I couldn't deliver them. These are your people because you're the one that bought them out. You're the one that redeemed them. Notice they have turned themselves away out of the way that I have commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it, said, this is your God, O Israel, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, this indeed is a stiff-necked people. Another word for stiff-necked is stubborn, right? They're going to do what they want to do no matter what. So God says to him, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation. One day is with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. Making another nation out of people and taking another 400 or 500 years to do it, no big deal for God. Okay? With us, it's beyond belief that he would do that. But with God, no problem. And notice the temptation here to Moses. I can make of you. I had promised that to Abraham, Isaac, but these people aren't worth saving. I'll make of you a great nation. You see, it says a lot about Moses that Moses still pleads. I think in a sense God had maybe been appealing to even Moses' pride. But look at Moses' heart. Moses had the heart of Jesus. And you compare the two, and again, this will be a great sermon in that respect. When you compare Moses and Jesus in a lot of these situations, you see them acting and doing the very same thing over and over again. The Hebrew writer makes that comparison and says Moses is the servant, Jesus is the son. But again, one of the great lessons in the book of Hebrews is how they're so much alike. Moses pleaded, verse 11, with God, the Lord, his God. Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people? Remember what God has said? These are your people, Moses. Moses said, no, God, they're your people. Wow. Which you have brought out of the land of Egypt with a great power and mighty hand. Why should the Egyptians speak and say he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? So God, number one, don't destroy these people because they're your people. You deliver them. And secondly, if you destroy them now, then your name will not be glorified, because the Egyptians are going to say that you couldn't deliver them into the land of Canaan like you promised you were going to. God is concerned about his name, because his name represents everything he is. God is a God that's faithful. And we're going to see this in just a few moments. So he says, turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm. Thirdly, here's the third point. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, I'll make your descendants as the stars of heaven. So the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. In a very real sense, is that not exactly what Jesus did? Lord, mankind is your creation. You've already destroyed it once with a flood, but Lord, I'll go and take the place. And Jesus steps in. And because of who God is, he pays for our sins, right? So you see, Moses has the heart of Jesus, and Jesus has the heart of God as well. Moses turned and went down from the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. Tablets were written on both sides, one on the side and the other on the written. And the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said, there's a sound of war in the camp. He said, no, it's not the sound of victory or the sound of defeat, but the sound of singing. And as soon as he came near the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. And Moses was hot. And he cast the tablets out of his hand and broke them out of the foot of the mountain. Then what did he do? I told the joke at the beginning. If you haven't remembered it, let me tell you again. Moses is the only person that broke all 10 commandments at once. Okay, now go on. Now, okay, here's the situation. He's the one that broke all of them at once. All right, he's the only man that's been able to do that. So he took the calf, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water and made the children of Israel drink. And Moses said to Aaron, now you remember back earlier in this chapter, Aaron threw that in there and he took an engraving tool and made what? Made a calf. Now look what happens. Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you brought so great a sin? He said, don't let the anger of my heart become hot. You know the people. They're set on evil. They said to me, make us gods. And the man, for us from this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him. So I said, whatever has any gold, let him break it off. And I cast it into the fire, and this calf came out. I'm sorry. Whenever I was bringing up children, sometimes they would give me these explanations, and I would sit there like, did I just hear that? Are you serious? Have you got to be kidding me? Remember, he took the engraving tool, but now Aaron says, it just came out. I'm sorry. It's amazing. And that's probably the reason why, again, in the book of Deuteronomy, God will emphasize the idea that, Moses will emphasize the idea, if I had not prayed for Aaron, Aaron would have been destroyed. Wow. That's an amazing thing. Again, it's a sad story, but it's somewhat funny, right? And so here it is. As you go on and read through this, Moses saw that the people were unrestrained, for the people, Aaron had not restrained them to the shame among the enemies. So he said, whoever's on the Lord's side, come to me. And all the sons of Levi came to him and says, put on your sword, go in and out from the campus, entrance to entrance throughout the camp, kill his brother, every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. Now, I don't think he's just out there randomly killing people. I think from what the context said, it suggests the idea that some of them, even though Moses had come down from the mount, some of them were still engaged in this worship. And when others started realizing what was happening and how God was angry, they quit. But these people were continuing no matter what. And I believe it's these that the tribe of Levi went through and started killing. And how many did they kill that day? 3,000. How many were saved on the day of Pentecost? 3,000. Isn't that interesting? Here you have a slaughter. On the day of Pentecost, when Jesus established his church, he'd already shed his blood for the new covenant. 3,000 were saved. All right? Then he says to the people, consecrate yourselves. Now, I tell you what, when you start going through the camp and you kill about 3,000 people, that's going to get people's attention, right? Every man has opposed his son and his brother. And it came to pass on the next day that the Lord said, or Moses said to the people, you've committed a great sin. Now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make an atonement for you. So he returns to the Lord. And says, Lord, now I want you to really key in on this. This is just a beautiful, beautiful passage here. These people have committed a great sin. They made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will not forgive their sin, if you will forgive their sin, please do so. But if not, blot me out of your book, which you have written. Hear Moses' heart again. I'm willing to take the punishment. I'm willing to pay the price, whatever it takes, for you to save your people. Wow. Now, where did Moses get that heart? I'm firmly convinced that there were 6 months to a year, as I've said before, of the calf, and then, or of the plagues, and then coming down to the children of Israel there at Mount Sinai. All this period of time, Moses has really grown close to the Lord. And I believe he knows God's heart. So he has the heart of God. The Lord said to Moses, whoever sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. You go lead the people to the place where I've spoken. My angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit for punishment, I will bring punishment upon them for their sin. So he plagued the people because of the calf that they made. Then the Lord goes on and says in chapter 33, depart and go up from here, you and the people, and go to the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will send my angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, and the Hivite. Go to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. And Moses again goes before God. And you see that he took his tent and pitched it outside the camp and called it the tabernacle of meeting. And this is where God met him now, as it was. The other tabernacle had not yet been built. That was part of the covenant that they broke. So part of the reason why we read about the details of the tabernacle from chapter 25 through 31 is that was broken whenever they broke the covenant. So then after chapter 35, going through the 40th chapter, he gives the details all over again. And we're sitting there thinking, why did he do that? Here's the reason why. They broke the covenant here, but now they had to be reinstituted with the covenant, so he has to give them the details again. What was the tabernacle's purpose? It was for them, or for God, to dwell in the midst of his people. Now he dwells in our hearts. But it was there for where God was wanting to be. The tabernacle represented God's presence among his people. They broke the covenant, so they couldn't build the tabernacle. Now they reaffirmed the covenant, and God allows them to build the tabernacle. And the book will close in Exodus chapter 40 with this cloud coming down upon the tabernacle, and none of the priests can get anywhere near it. And what does it represent? God has come down among his people. Again, think about the symbolism in the New Testament. We have the Spirit dwelling in us. We have Christ dwelling in us. We have the Father dwelling in us, right? It's not some building, it's in us. So many things that we could talk about, right? So he emphasizes they saw the pillar of cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses face to face. Now, again, here you have this idea of face to face. Did Moses see God? Later in this chapter, we're going to see that no, he couldn't see God. Notice also as you're looking at this, he said, you go, but I'm not going with you because I'm afraid that I will destroy this people because of their sin. So Moses said, verse 12, you say to me, bring up this people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you've said, I know you by name, and you have found grace in my sight. If I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you and find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. He says, my presence will go with you. It seems like Moses has to talk to God and ask God for himself to come with him. And this is a very crucial passage in Exodus, because had Moses not done that, the tabernacle probably would not have been built, right? You see the point? So Moses is pleading with God. He says, I want, and so he says, God says, or Moses said to him, verse 15, chapter 33, if your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here. How then will it be known that your people and I have found grace in your sight, except you go with us? We shall be separate, your people and I, from all the people upon the face of the earth. So he says, I will do this thing that you have spoken. You have found grace in my sight, that I may know you by name. And he said, please show me your glory. Then he said, I will make my goodness pass before you, and I'll proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face. So if what this passage is saying is true, and it is, when the passage said earlier that the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, it suggests some sort of a direct communication between God and Moses, not necessarily face to face, but because, again, he says, what? You cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and what? Live. Why? Because God is so holy and man is so sinful. So he tells him, the Lord tells Moses, stand by, here's a place by me. I'll let my glory pass by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand. And I'll take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Now, this is called a theophany. It's a big word that suggests the idea of where a man sees God. That's all it is. But really, God is a spirit. Does God have a back? If God is a spirit, does God have a back? We will read about the arm of the Lord. Does God have arms? We would think sometimes, well, we're made in the image of God, so everything we've got, God has. Well, I think, again, that's the Bible's way to try to help us to understand who God is. But if God is a spirit, he does not have a back. He does not have arms. He does not have all the things. But it's a figure of speech, or what we call a theophany, was a figure to where they could see some aspect of God to believe that what they saw did actually come from God. Again, the thing about Christians is that when we finally get to heaven, we're going to be spirit beings before the spirit being. So again, I can't wrap my mind totally around that idea. All right. Y'all chew on that one for a while. If you have a better explanation for it, please let me know. But think about that. He's a spirit being. We're spirit beings. So he actually sees the back part of God. And again, we have to understand this in light of the rest of the Bible. So then, here we go. Now I want you to see this. He makes 2 new tablets, and he goes back on the mountain and presents yourself to me on top of the mountain. And no man shall come up with you, and let no man be seen throughout all the mountain, let neither flocks nor herds feed from before that mountain. So he cut 2 tables of stone, like the first one. He rose up early on the mountain, went back up Mount Sinai, and the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. Now, chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 is extremely important. Because again, what we have happening is God ratifying a covenant again. And again, he has already shown them that he is a God that is able to deliver them out of Egyptian bondage. Now he wants them to know something else about him. And look what he says in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon their children, the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. As God reveals himself, as he once again sets up this treaty, this covenant with them, look at how he describes himself. This becomes crucial in the Bible over and over again. Let me give you some. I'm trying to find it. All right. This becomes the foundation of biblical theology. This passage is repeated over and over again in the Old Testament. All right? Let me give you some of these passages just to show you how important this passage is. Numbers chapter 14, 18. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 17. Psalms chapter 103, verses 8 and 17. Chapter 145, verse 8. Jeremiah 32, 18 and 19. Joel chapter 2, 13. And Jonah chapter 4, verse 2. Now, these passages will quote this over and over again. Now, these also echoes of this ideal is found in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. 1 Kings 3, verse 6. 1 Kings 3, 6. Lamentations 3:32. Daniel 9:4. And Nahum 1:3. You think being quoted that many times is important? You think God is wanting to get this ideal across to them? I think that is the case. I think that absolutely is the case. He's really wanting them to get these points. Now, what I'm going to do is right there. So those of you online, you should be able to get it. All right, you should see everything that I've written down right then if you want to jot it down. Okay, can you see that? Everybody online? There you go. I know you weren't going to be able to see it here. So I'm going to give you a few minutes so you could drop that down. So this becomes really, as you think about it, the foundation of a lot of the rest of the Old Testament. But this also describes God as he wants us to know him, as he wanted them to know him. He does not want them to know him as a God that's ready to squash people whenever they sin. What is he wanting them to know? I'm a God that is merciful. I am the Lord God. I am Yahweh Elohim. I want you to know first off that I'm merciful. Now, sometimes we have this tendency to take advantage of his mercy. Maybe sometimes we think, well, I'm going to go ahead and sin anyway. I know God will be merciful and gracious to me. But we become very, very dangerous right then, doesn't it? Right? So he says he's merciful and gracious, long-suffering. What does the word long-suffering mean? Long time. Suffering long. Okay. And again, as you think about this, now, I wanted to spend some time emphasizing this because this is a very, very, very important passage. All righty? He says, I'm abounding in goodness and truth. Are you going to say something? Anybody going to say something? Okay. Anybody? All right. Did everybody get that copied? Okay. All righty. Good deal. Again, this all happened after the context of that. I'm going to try. Okay. Yahweh El suggests the idea that, let me see. He's compassionate. All right. The word compassionate. The word merciful. Compassionate is another word there. The word compassionate means there's a deep love rooted in some natural, let's see if I can kind of make this a little bit smaller. Okay, it's rooted in some natural bond. It's the love of a superior for an inferior, a deep, tender feeling of compassion because you see the weakness of the person that's suffering. And so again, this is the bond that God has with his children. God's compassion a lot of time is linked with his faithfulness. In Isaiah 54, verse 7, he says, for a mere moment I have forsaken you, but with great compassion, he says, I will gather you. So his compassion, and I love this, allows him to deal with weak and failing people, right? Think about the idea next. He is favorable to them. He's gracious to them. Again, what is gracious? You have something that you can give to help somebody else. And that's what God is. He's the stronger person who helps a weaker one who has no claim for such treatment. That's grace, right? People ask me, how you doing? I'm better than I deserve. Why? Because I'm living by grace. Why? Because I don't deserve what God gives me, but he gives me it to and gives it to me anyway. God has no ulterior motive behind this other than we need him. So he is so gracious that he will not forsake his people. Nehemiah 9, verse 17 and 31. He hears the cry of the poor. He will not turn away from the penitent. Okay? Next, he's slow to anger. One person said sin is an act of cosmic treason. It's looking God in the eye and slapping him in the face and saying, I don't care what you think. And you see, the problem is, think about it. God's anger is not sinful, nor is it fierce. God's anger is tempered by his love. The closest we could get to it is perhaps the feeling of a parent with a child. You get angry at what the child does. Some parents don't control their anger, and abuse happens. But a parent that loves is going to discipline out of love, not because he's mad at what has been done. And again, thinking about that, God's anger is not sinful. God's anger is not fierce. God's anger is controlled, and that's what we need to always see through Scripture. When we think about God's wrath, we think about, oh, how heinous God's wrath really is, and it is. But just think about the fact he's controlling it. If he hasn't been controlling it, this place would have been destroyed again. You see, he's offended by our sin. And so the Bible says he's slow to anger. The Hebrew word for slow to anger here is have you ever seen anybody when they get angry and their face flushes red? Right? All right? The Hebrew has the ideal of a long nose, all right? Slow to anger. In other words, you see the blood rushing and it's going down to all parts of the face, down to the tip of the nose. Well, he has a long nose in the fact that what? He doesn't allow it to get to that point to where he just strikes out. He's got it under control. So it's like, and one person said he's slow to anger. It's kind of like, again, parents. Okay, this is what we're going to do. You know what I'm saying? And again, this is something that parents do. You watch them. I saw my daddy do it on numerous occasions with me. Okay, they're trying to get themselves under control. That's what God. Now, I want you to understand this. God is not trying. He's keeping himself under control. But you see, he's slow. God is in no hurry to judge sinners. We sinners want God to hurry up and judge the world, don't we? Lord, go ahead and destroy these people that's doing wrong. And God says, no, they might be saved. And we're sitting there, God, what's the matter with you? What's taking you so long? And God's saying, no, I want them to be saved. He's slow to anger. All right? He's abounding in goodness and truth. He's abounding in kindness and favor, in pity, in stability. The word truth here is the ideal that's used 127 times in the Old Testament, suggesting the ideal of trustworthiness. He's abundant, all right, in goodness. He keeps mercy for thousands. So again, he forgives iniquity. We're here tonight because he forgives. I'm grateful. But he will at the same time what? No means clear the guilty. And so he's forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Well, if he doesn't clear it, how does he forgive it? How did he forgive it? He sent his son to pay for it himself. Right? He said, okay, I'll pay you. I'll pay for your bill if you just trust me enough to do what I say. And by the way, isn't that what God has said all along with his people? If you just do what I say. And we are the hardest people in the world to learn this from, right? So when you're sitting there thinking about that, I want you to meditate upon that whole idea this next week, maybe, and think about how much of a difference this makes. This passage will preach, and you can find it over and over and over again in the New Testament. And that's what the New Testament is about. How God is what he had just said here in Exodus chapter 34. Now, I know we're cutting to the end. So, the last part of chapter 34, he again remakes this covenant. And again, look at it. He starts with a lot of these things. You shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall make no molded god. The feast of unleavened bread. All that open the womb are mine. The first male, firstborn are mine. And he goes down through and 6 days you shall work. As you read the last part there, then what? Moses is talking to God, and his face becomes shining. Paul will reference this in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 3. That every time Moses came down and spoke to them, they saw his face shining, and he had to put a veil on his face. Paul will reference this in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and emphasize the idea and make the comparison between the old law and the new law. Okay? Now, as I said, next week we will go into detail about the tabernacle, and then we will go from there. Okay? Thank you guys so much for all your study. Keep up the good work, and I appreciate you so much. And brother, Seth, I've still got 41% on my battery, so good deal. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate all of you guys so very, very much. Thank you, and may God bless you all. All righty. Keep on studying. All righty. Okay. And stop the recording.